Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm adding to the seasonal series. This is my second autumn doodle, so let's start by sketching the little elements that we want to include. Before making this doodle, I actually wanted to paint a tiny house, so I decided to just turn it into an element for this doodle instead. I want the house to be surrounded by autumn colored bushes, and this will be the first thing that I draw in the middle as the main element. Of course, for these types of doodles, you can always include your own elements from autumn, but these are just the things that I thought of at the time. So that's the main element. I also decided to add a chimney smoke to make it look a bit more warm and cozy. After this, I'm going to draw an umbrella in a water puddle. And since this is a doodle, I'm not going to think about the details, I'm just drawing out simple shapes. And this is just how I imagine things. For my previous seasonal doodles, I put a bit more thought into it, or at least I knew the items that I wanted to paint. But for this particular one, I was just going along with the things that came to mind. So I just add things as I go instead of sectioning out certain parts of the paper. I love to be cozy, and autumn is probably my favorite season along with spring, so there were so many little items that popped in my head. It's the end of summer as I'm painting this, but I'm trying to imagine the feeling of coziness in autumn, the trickling of rain, and the warm colored foliage. But for you, since this is going to be posted in the middle of autumn, you can take inspiration from what's around you. I'll be back in Austria in autumn, so I'm really anticipating this atmosphere and I'm super excited for it. Instead of sectioning out the page like I usually do, I like to think of objects that can fit well next to the previous objects that I just drew out. So of course this can be erased and adjusted, but if there are any small spaces that seems like it still needs to be filled but it's not big enough for certain objects, I like to add small things like acorns, or maybe you can add berries, nuts, or leaves, or things of that nature. I honestly enjoy this organic approach to doodling as well. I feel like the space can be filled a bit more creatively as we're trying to work on things as we go, and it somehow looks a bit less stiff because we're using the space that we have to work with other objects rather than just sectioning out things. I guess that's what doodling is supposed to be, but sometimes I just feel a bit too intimidated to do that in the morning after I wake up and I need to film. But since autumn is my favorite season and I'm quite comfortable drawing these items, it's really nice that I had the chance to do this. So let me know what you guys think. What's your preferred method when it comes to doodling these types of tiny little things in your sketchbook? It'll be really interesting to read in the comments. I know that creative processes often depends on mood, so do you have any preferred method of painting depending on your current mood or emotions? It was just a thought, and I'm just going to continue to fill in the rest of the tiny spaces, and then I'm going to outline everything. I just wanted to do something super simple today, so the painting later would just be like coloring in these little outlines. For the outline, I'm using my Sakura Micron pen, and the color is in Sepia because I like the warmth that it gives. However, if you only have access to black pens, you can also use the black. I just prefer the brown, so it's a little bit softer. I love adding doodle textures as well. So as an example, you can see in the roof, I create U shapes to represent the tiles of the roof. And I also like to play with the line weight as well as the attachment of the lines. Sometimes I like to break it up into dashed lines instead. Personally, this is why I love doodling. It's actually the cute textures that you can add to things, which makes the process more pleasurable. Since I'm going to be painting these elements, I'm not going to add too many textures though. However, if you just intend this to be an ink doodle, feel free to add more shading and textures to create form. I actually think that this doodle would also work as an ink doodle, so yeah, just pick and choose which style you want to go for. For the moths, I've left the wings blank as the pencil sketch, but I'm going to add patterns with the pen. It's really fun to add doodle marks on top of them and follow the shape of the wings. And if you're running out of ideas, you can also look up for references for patterns. This applies to all the elements. These are just the textures that I thought of during this time, but you can also create other designs for things like the umbrella or add more etching to some of the items to create more form. Anyway, I'm just going to leave you guys to it. I hope you enjoy watching this outlining process. This was definitely really fun for me to do. I'm going to put some relaxing music in the background to go with this, and I'll get back to you once we're ready to paint. After outlining all the elements, I decided to switch to a lighter brown pen, and I'm going to add some finer textures like the branches inside of the bushes and some textures for the leaves as well. This is just so it's a bit lighter and it's not as dark as the previous one. I'm not sure if it shows on camera though. But once I'm done, I'm going to erase everything, then I'm going to go over the colors that I'll be using. This is Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Shine Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Paints Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Crimson Lake by Holbein, and Vermilion by Holbein. This is optional, but I'm going to use this gold from my Finetec gold. And here are the pens that I used before. This is my Sakura Micron pen in the size 03 in the color Sepia. And the lighter brown is by Unipin Fine Line 0.5. Now let's begin to paint. Since I have these primary colors here, I don't really need too many colors on my palette. So I'm starting with a green from a mix of Paints Grey Bluish and Permanent Yellow Deep. You can see that the green is nice and deep, and I really love this tone for autumn. Then for the leaves, I'm going to add more Permanent Yellow Deep in the ratio so the color is a little bit more bright. So even with just these two colors, you can play around with the ratio to create different tones of greens. For the bush at the back, I first used the yellow-green with more Permanent Yellow Deep in the ratio, and on the right hand side I used a mix with more Paints Grey Bluish. In front, I want to create an orangey or a very warm color for the bush, so I used the previous mix with more Permanent Yellow Deep and a bit of vermilion this time. Now I'm going to make a dark brown for the roof of the house. For this I used Paints Grey Bluish and Crimson Lake to create a dark purple, then I mixed it with the orange from Permanent Yellow Deep and Vermilion. For the exterior of the house, I'm going to use a thin to medium consistency of Jaune Brilliant Dark. Then after painting it on, I'm going to leave it to dry and paint on the glass windows using a light consistency of Payne's Grey Bluish. For the door, I initially used the dark green mix, but I painted over it using the brown for the roof. Then once the exterior is completely dry, I decided to paint on some brick textures using a thicker consistency of the Jaune Brilliant. Later, I felt like the texture looked too subtle, so I'm actually going to outline it using my light brown pen. I'm just lining a little bit of light brown underneath this roof to give it a bit of shadow. Then with the same color, I'm going to use it to paint the fence. As you can see, I'm treating previous color mixtures as their own colors. I don't have brown, but since I already made it on my palette, I just need to add a bit of orange, which is also a mixture that I've created earlier in order to make a yellow ochre sort of tone. This is why even if I only have a limited palette, I can still create so many colors with a consistent tone. This gray is also a color that I'll be using quite a bit for this painting. I just basically added Payne's Grey Bluish with Jaune Brilliant Dark as the base, then you can add any other hue to adjust the temperature. You can add a bit of browns or reds to make the gray look more neutral and so on. I want this ball of yarn to be pink, so I use a mix of Vermilion and Jaune Brilliant Dark. And at the back, I'm going to use the previous gray. This has a bit more yellow and Payne's Grey Bluish in the mix, so it has a green tone. For the snail, I'm also going to use the light brown, which is almost like a yellow ochre, and I use the dark brown from the roof to paint some of the patterns on the shell. Then I'm going to go back in with the yellow ochre mix to paint in between. Still working with the same two browns, I'm going to use them to paint the acorns as well. I still have the gray-green left on my palette, so I'm going to use it to paint the oak leaves, but later on I think I'm going to layer a bit of orange on top. I want the berries to be a deep red, and since vermilion is a bit too orangey, I added some Crimson Lake to turn it into a deeper primary red. While painting the berries, I left a white dot for each one so they look glossy. For the other berries, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish and a bit of Crimson Lake, which will create an even deeper tone, but it's slightly purplish, and I'm just going to paint them one by one. These are too small for me to leave white dots, but I still tried to leave a little bit of space in between. Next, for the puddle of water and the rain, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Grey Bluish and Jaune Brilliant Dark. For the raindrops, I'm going to make some highlights so it doesn't look too flat. And as for the puddle, I'm just going to follow the curvature of the puddle and leave out some highlights as well. And once I have good coverage, I'm going to use a thicker consistency to paint the front to give a little bit of height to the water. Next, let's paint the pumpkin. I just use a mix of vermilion and permanent yellow deep. I started with a medium to thin consistency to cover the base. Then while the surface is still damp, I'm going to use a thicker consistency to paint section by section for the bottom of the pumpkin. I'm going to do the same thing for this pumpkin, but to make the color a little bit more muted, I added some Crimson Lake as well into the mix. Next, for the stem of the pumpkin, I used Payne's Grey Bluish with Crimson Lake and Vermilion. There was also a bit of yellow still on my palette that is mixed into it. I started with a thin consistency, then I'm going to follow this up with a thicker consistency to paint one side of the stem, and I'm also going to paint the coils as how I drew them out. Once the pumpkins are completely dry, I see that the colors are evening out, so I'm going to use the same color mixture to add on more shadows underneath. To make a darker version of the base color, I just used less permanent yellow deep in the mix. I also want to create a gradient for the mushroom and starting with the orange mixture from Permanent Yellow Deep and Vermilion. Then along the sides, I just use Vermilion in a medium to thick consistency, trying to create a soft transition in between. Then right around the edge, while the surface is still damp, I added a thick consistency of Crimson Lake. For the stem, I'm going to use yellow and Payne's Grey Bluish with a bit of vermilion as well as Jaune Brilliant Dark. This will create a muddy sort of brown. I'm starting with a thin consistency to paint the base color, then I use a thicker consistency to paint the shadows right underneath the mushrooms as well as under the gills. I really like the blue of the puddle, so I'm also going to use the same mix from Payne's Grey Bluish and Jaune Brilliant to paint the main color of the socks. For the top of the socks, I decided to add more Payne's Grey Bluish and Crimson Lake for a slightly darker tone. I'm going to use the neutral gray to paint the toe and the heel, and as for the rest of the design, I use a light consistency of the yellow ochre mix. Now for the jumper, I want this to match the socks, so I'm going to use more or less similar colors. This is basically the same blue as the socks with added Jaune Brilliant Dark, and I'm just going to use a thicker consistency of the blue to paint the sides to give it a three-dimensional form. I think I've pretty much covered all of the color mixtures. For the rest of the painting, I'm going to use more or less similar color mixtures, but probably just a little bit different in terms of the ratio. If there are any small designs like these dots from the wings of the moth, I'm just going to use my brown pen. When it's colored, I'm just going to paint it in, but it is a bit easier to use things like colored pencils if you have colors that will match the tone of your doodles. Now that I've painted all of the elements, I'm going to add shadows using the dark version of the same base color. I'm also going to add some cast shadows for certain objects. This is just to darken overall colors and make sure that the colors look less faded as well. You can also add textures along the way. For the berries here, I'm painting under the berries so they look a bit more rounded and you can see a bit more definition now. Even if I've painted some of the shadows beforehand, I feel like this contrast makes each element pop a little bit more. Since the pumpkins are quite large, I decided to use a really dark version of the same color. This has a lot more Crimson Lake and I'm also using a really thick consistency. Then I just tried to soften the edges using a clean damp brush. Going back to the pumpkin, I feel like the swirls here look too thin, so I'm just going over it again. For the frames of the window, I'm just going to fill in the color using my light brown pen, and I also feel like the brick texture looks a bit weak, so I'm going to go over it with this brown pen as well. This is basically finished, but for some reason I still felt like doodling, so I decided to add some gold into the painting. There weren't too many places I can add the gold to, so I ended up adding dots to fill in some of the small spaces. And I sadly overdid it. I feel like it would be more wise to add things like sparkles or stars instead of just random blobs. So I actually ended up taking off some of the dots after having a good look and not liking how full everything looks. At this point, I didn't realize it though, so I just went back in again while I was trying to make that decision. I just add a little bit more details to the doodles, adding more pen doodles on top of these socks and darkening certain colors again. I still wanted to include more colors for some reason, so I decided to add a bit of a light background behind the house and the mushrooms. This is when I finally made the decision to take off some of the gold dots, and to take some of them off, I just reactivated the areas using clean water, then take off the reactivated paint with tissue. And that's it for this doodle, another one added to the seasonal doodle series. By the way, I'll have the link to the coffee shop outline in the description box along with a list of tools and my social media links. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing, and if you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end. I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!